I remember that night like it just happened yesterday. The funeral home was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just dead quiet. The kind that hums in your ears until you start hearing things that aren't really there. I was working the late shift, the kind of shift no one wanted. The embalming room lights buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds, and the smell of chemicals clung to my clothes. I was alone, or at least I was supposed to be. The first story isn't mine, but I can't forget it. It happened to a guy named Mark, who worked for a small-town funeral home in Ohio. He was the kind of man who took his job too seriously, never joked, never smiled. One night, he was prepping the body of an elderly woman who'd passed away in a nursing home. Routine case. But her family had requested a closed casket because of facial damage from her fall. Mark didn't question it, until he noticed something strange. The bruising around her mouth wasn't from a fall. It looked like she'd been smothered. He reported it to his boss, expecting it to be handled quietly. 2 days later, Mark came in and found the woman's body gone. No record, no paperwork. His boss told him the family had come early to take her for burial. But when Mark called the family later, the daughter said they hadn't received the body yet. That night, Mark stayed late to check the basement storage. The cold room light was out, so he used his phone's flashlight. There in the corner, under a white sheet, was the same body. But this time, her face looked different. Her mouth was open, her eyes slightly parted. Like she'd been screaming when the freezer door closed. Mark quit a week later. But before he left, he told one of the assistants something that still chills me. He said every time he closed that freezer door, he'd hear the faintest sound from inside, like soft fingernails dragging down metal. He wasn't sure if it was real. But he said he started counting the sounds, and they always stopped at 10. The second story comes from a woman named Clara, who worked in a family-run funeral home in Michigan. She'd been there for years, organized the viewings, handled families, kept everything spotless. The owner trusted her more than anyone. One night, she came in to prepare the viewing room for a last-minute service. The deceased was a man in his 40s, auto accident. The body was intact, but the paperwork had a few odd notes. Do not open the casket after 7 p.m. Clara didn't think much of it. The man's wife had been hysterical during drop-off, and families made strange requests all the time. Around 8 p.m., Clara noticed something. The faintest knocking sound. Soft. Repetitive. It was coming from the casket. Her stomach turned cold. She told herself it was the wood settling, or the building shifting in the night. But the knocking continued. Louder. More frantic. She ran to call her boss, but her phone died mid-ring. When she came back, the sound had stopped. She forced herself to check. Slowly opened the lid just a few inches, nothing. Just the man, perfectly still. The next morning, the man's wife arrived early, her face pale, hands shaking. She told Clara she had something to confess. The night before the crash, she'd given her husband a heavy dose of sleeping pills. He'd been threatening to leave her for someone else. She panicked and caused the crash herself. She thought he'd died instantly, but maybe he hadn't. The autopsy report came a week later. His lungs had traces of air. He'd been alive when they put him in the casket. Clara never worked another funeral after that. She said the knocking sound still plays in her head when she's alone at night. The third story, that one is mine. It happened last year. I just started working at a small funeral home outside Dallas. My boss, Harold, was a quiet man in his 60s. The kind who never left his office and kept the doors locked after hours. My job was mostly cleanup and prep, washing instruments, sealing bags, writing tags. Simple stuff. But one night, while I was cataloging personal items, I found something that didn't belong. A small gold necklace, child-sized, engraved with a name, Sophie. There were no records for any child named Sophie that week. When I asked Harold about it, he just stared at me for a long time before saying, "Put it back." Then he went back into his office and locked the door. The next day, a family came in asking about their daughter's belongings. The girl, Sophie, had died 3 weeks earlier. I checked the logs. Her body had already been cremated. But her tag number wasn't in the cremation report. When I mentioned it to Harold, he snapped. Told me to mind my own business. That night, I stayed late again. I heard noises from the back, metal trays clinking, footsteps where there shouldn't be any. I followed the sound down to the embalming room. The freezer door was slightly open. Inside, I saw the metal rack with 3 covered bodies. One of the sheets was too short, showing a small foot. A child. I felt sick. I called out for Harold, but there was no answer. I shut the freezer, locked the door, and drove home shaking. The next morning, Harold didn't show up for work. The police came a few hours later. They said someone had filed a missing persons report for Harold's wife. They searched the building, every room, every drawer. They never found Harold. But in the back storage room, behind a false panel in the wall, they found 6 unregistered bodies. 2 were children. One had a gold necklace that read Sophie. I quit that night. I still don't know what Harold was doing, or why those bodies were hidden. Sometimes, I wonder if he was covering something up, or someone else's crimes. But what haunts me most isn't what I saw. It's what I heard when I left the building for the last time. As I locked the door behind me, somewhere deep inside the walls, there was a sound. Soft, rhythmic, like fingernails on metal. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But even now, whenever I pass a funeral home, I can almost hear it again. 10 slow, dragging sounds. Always 10. And then silence. After that night, things at the funeral home started to feel off. The kind of off you can't explain to anyone without sounding paranoid. The air felt heavier. The halls seemed longer. Even the fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual. I told myself it was just my mind replaying what I'd seen, but something deep inside me knew it wasn't over. A week after Harold vanished, I went back to pack my things. The place was supposed to be shut down for investigation, but no one stopped me. The police had come and gone, taken their photos, their notes, but they'd left behind the silence. When I unlocked the side door, the air inside was thick and cold. The smell of disinfectant still clung to the walls. I remember thinking how the building itself felt aware, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to walk deeper in. I kept hearing faint sounds, like movement from the back rooms. Not loud enough to be sure. Just a shuffle here, a creak there. Every sound echoed too long. I walked past the viewing room, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing by the casket table, a dark outline motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. My chest tightened. Something caught my attention. The freezer door was open again. Just slightly. The same way I'd left it that night. Only this time, there was condensation dripping from the handle, like someone had opened it recently. My name tag, which I'd left on the counter days ago, was lying on the floor beneath it. I knelt to pick it up, and I noticed faint scratches on the tile below the freezer. Thin, curved marks in sets of 10. I didn't have the courage to look inside. Instead, I turned toward Harold's office. The door was unlocked for the first time since I'd worked there. The air inside was stale. Papers were scattered across the desk, unfinished reports, cremation records, death certificates with names scratched out in black ink. But what made my skin crawl was the smell. Not the usual chemical tang. This was metallic, faintly sweet. There was a file sitting on his desk labeled Special Cases. Inside were photos, bodies that looked normal at first glance. But each one had small, almost invisible scars near the jawline. Like someone had stitched and then carefully hidden it under makeup. My stomach turned as I flipped through. One of the photos was dated just 2 weeks before Harold disappeared. A little girl. Sophie. Her tag number matched the one missing from the system. As I stood there, I heard a faint clicking noise from the hallway. It was steady, mechanical, like the metal tray wheels rolling slowly against the tiles. I called out, thinking maybe someone had come back. But there was no answer. Just clicking moving closer. I froze, trying to steady my breathing. The light above the doorway flickered once, twice, and then went out. The noise stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything. Then one sharp metallic tap. Just one. Right behind the office door. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my bag and ran, my heart slamming against my ribs. But as I reached the exit, I realized something that made me stop cold. The front door, the one I'd come through, was already unlocked when I arrived. I was sure I'd locked it the last time I left. Someone else had been inside before me. And maybe they never left. I should have left right then. But something in me needed to know. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I turned back toward the hallway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. The flashlight beam wobbled across the walls, catching on empty gurneys, old flower stands, and the polished metal of the embalming tables. Everything looked too clean, too perfect, like someone had wiped away every trace of what happened here. Then I saw it. A shadow moved across the far end of the corridor. It wasn't my reflection. It was slow, deliberate, like someone watching me and waiting for me to notice. I whispered, "Harold." My voice cracked halfway through. The shadow stopped moving. I edged closer, trying to convince myself it was just the light. But when I turned the corner, my stomach dropped. The freezer door was open again, wide this time. A pale fog spilled out and curled along the floor. My flashlight flickered, then died. I could still see my breath in the air, even though the rest of the room was warm. I reached for the handle, my pulse pounding in my ears. Inside, there were no bodies, just one small tray pushed halfway out. On it lay the gold necklace, the one that said Sophie. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It was warm. That's when I noticed something else. Faint scratches on the inside of the freezer door. Not old ones, fresh. You could still see the flakes of paint curling at the edges. 10 marks. Always 10. I stumbled backward, and that's when I heard it, the sound of the door creaking shut. I turned, but it wasn't the freezer. It was the office door at the end of the hall, slowly swinging open. The same door I'd just closed. A figure stepped out, dressed in a stained lab coat. Face pale, eyes empty. For a second, my brain refused to believe what I was seeing. It was Harold, but his skin looked stretched too tight, like it didn't fit right. His jaw moved unnaturally, a faint clicking sound with every twitch. His lips parted, and in a voice that didn't sound like him anymore, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." The last thing I remember is the metallic smell filling the air, and the freezer door slamming shut behind me. When I came to, I was lying on the floor near the back exit, my head throbbing and my clothes damp from the condensation. The building was silent again, but not in the same way as before. It felt hollow, like something had just left. The freezer door was closed, and the office lights were off. There was no sign of Harold. No footprints. No sound. Just the low hum of the ventilation system, steady and calm, as if nothing had happened. I grabbed my phone. It was cracked but still working, and called the police. I didn't even know what to say. How could I explain that I'd seen my missing boss walking around with skin that didn't look like his? When the officers arrived, they searched every inch of the place. Nothing. No Harold. No hidden bodies. Even the freezer was empty. They looked at me like I was another burned-out worker who'd seen too much death. Maybe they were right. I quit that same night, packed what little I had, and left town before sunrise. But the images wouldn't leave me. Harold's face, stretched, unnatural. The scratches inside the door. The sound of that faint, dragging metal. Weeks later, I read online that the funeral home had burned down in an electrical fire. The report said no one was found inside. But I keep thinking about that freezer. About what might have still been behind that wall. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the tapping, 10 slow metallic sounds. Always 10. Then silence. I don't talk about that night anymore. Not because I'm afraid no one will believe me, but because I'm afraid someone will. There's a difference between seeing death and realizing what people can do with it. Working in that place stripped away whatever piece I had left. Death used to mean an ending. Now it just feels like a pause. Like something that waits in the dark for someone to make use of it again. I moved to another city, got a job far from anything to do with the dead. But every time I walk past a hospital or see a hearse drive by, my stomach twists. I still dream of Harold sometimes. In those dreams, he's standing by the freezer door, motionless, his face calm, like he's waiting for me to finish what he started. And in the background, I always hear that faint sound, 10 slow drags of metal. Never 11. Never 9. Always 10. Sometimes, I wonder if he was covering something up, or if he became part of it. Maybe that's what happens when you spend too long around death. You start blending into it, piece by piece, until no one can tell the difference anymore. The fire might have burned the building down, but I don't think it ended anything. Because sometimes late at night, when everything's quiet, I can still hear that sound from somewhere far off. The same slow rhythm, like something still waiting to be found. I still remember the smell that night, disinfectant mixed with roses. The scent clung to my skin long after I left the funeral home. I was new then, only 3 months into the job. The place was small, family-owned, and quiet. Nothing strange ever happened there until that one evening when a storm rolled through town and the power went out halfway through a service. We had 2 bodies scheduled that night. One was an elderly woman, Mrs. Porter, whose family insisted on an open casket. The other was a young man, no family, no visitors, a Jane Doe-type burial that no one wanted to claim. When the lights flickered off, my supervisor, Kevin, told me to stay with the elderly woman's body while he went to check the generator. I remember standing there with just a flashlight beam trembling in my hand, the room filled with shadows that seemed to move when I blinked. I felt this strange guilt for looking at her face for too long. Her lips were sewn, her eyes faintly opened beneath the glue. The storm howled outside, and in that silence between thunder, I heard something, metal shifting, a tray rolling somewhere in the back room. When Kevin came back, he was sweating, pale, nervous. He said nothing about the noise, just told me to switch the ID tags on the two bodies for internal reasons. I asked why. He stared at me for a long time before whispering, "It's better if you don't know." That was the moment I realized something inside that building wasn't about death anymore. It was about secrets. After that night, Kevin acted differently. He avoided the prep room completely, always sending me down there alone. Every time I passed the freezer, I noticed new paperwork taped to the doors, written in shaky handwriting. Things like "Do not open this one again," or "Move tomorrow, urgent." One evening, I came in early and saw Kevin sitting in the viewing room with the lights off. He was holding something small in his hand, a silver necklace. When he noticed me, he shoved it into his pocket and muttered something about lost property. But the way his hands trembled told me it wasn't just that. Later that night, when I was cleaning the embalming station, I noticed the old woman's casket was gone, even though her family's service wasn't until the next day. I checked the schedule, nothing had changed. When I asked Kevin, he brushed it off, said the family had moved up the burial. But when they arrived the following morning, they were furious. The casket they opened wasn't their mother, it was the young man. I'll never forget the scream her daughter made when she saw the wrong face staring back. Kevin took the blame instantly. He said it was his mistake, a tagging error, a simple mix-up. But later that night, I found him in the basement, whispering to himself, pacing in the dark. He kept saying, "It was supposed to be easy. No one was supposed to notice." I followed him the next day when he thought I'd gone home. He went down to the freezer with a duffel bag and stayed there for almost an hour. When he came out, he locked the door and pocketed the key. I waited until he left, then went in. The smell hit first, stronger than anything I'd ever smelled in that place. And there on the middle tray wasn't a body anymore. Just an empty space and a note. It said, "She's with him now." I had to fix it. That's when I realized Kevin had been covering up something far worse than a mistake. The police came 2 days later after the family filed a complaint. By then, Kevin had disappeared. They questioned me for hours, assuming I knew what he'd done. But I didn't, not until I checked the security footage myself. There was no sound, just grainy video. It showed Kevin opening the freezer, pulling out the young man's body, and placing something beside it. Then, he knelt down and touched the man's hand. For a moment, he just stayed there, completely still. When he stood, he was crying. Then I saw what he'd placed beside the body, Mrs. Porter's necklace. The one her daughter said had gone missing from the casket. He'd switched them on purpose. He'd cremated the woman under the young man's name and sent the man's body to her family's burial. And when the police found him a week later, parked outside the cemetery, he'd taken his own life in his car. In his pocket was a photo of Mrs. Porter and the young man together, years earlier. Turns out, they weren't strangers at all. She was his mother. All that time, he'd been hiding the truth from the family. The Jane Doe wasn't unknown. It was her son, estranged for years, unclaimed because he'd changed his name. Kevin knew. He'd buried her lie, and then his own. After the police investigation, the funeral home shut down. I helped clean out the place, boxing up documents, photos, and records. In Kevin's office, I found one last file labeled Porter Case. Inside was a single line written in his handwriting. I just wanted them to rest together. For days after, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that night, his pale face in the dark, the storm outside. He hadn't been afraid of getting caught. He'd been afraid of being alone with what he'd done. Maybe that's what drove him. The worst part was telling Mrs. Porter's daughter. She cried not from anger, but from something deeper, understanding. She said her mother always talked about fixing the mistakes of the past. Maybe this was her way, even after death. Still, when I closed that building for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing in the viewing room, watching me leave. The air felt heavy again, like it did that first night. It's strange how death brings out the truth people try their whole lives to bury. Working there taught me that funerals aren't really about the dead. They're about the living, trying to rewrite what they can't accept. Kevin thought he was doing the right thing, giving a mother and son the peace they never had in life. But he crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. I still don't know if he did it out of love or guilt. Maybe both. Maybe that's what makes it worse. I've moved on, but every time it rains, I remember that night. The storm, the darkness, his voice whispering, "It's better if you don't know." I wish I'd listened. Because now I understand, sometimes the dead don't haunt you. The living do. And what they leave behind isn't always bodies. Sometimes it's the unbearable weight of what they couldn't confess. And every time I walk past a graveyard, I still wonder if somewhere, buried under the wrong names, they're finally resting together, or if Kevin's mistake keeps them both awake in the dark. There's something different about working nights in a funeral home. The silence isn't peaceful, it's heavy, like it's pressing against your chest. I used to tell myself it was just the air conditioning or the hum of the refrigerators, but I knew better. The building had its own kind of heartbeat. I started at St. Vincent's mortuary after losing my job at the hospital. Night shift. Just me, one embalmer, and the janitor. My main job was to log entries and monitor the security feeds. Most nights were uneventful, just paperwork and coffee. But then, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Sometimes, a light would flicker on in one of the prep rooms after I'd turned everything off. Or a body tag would be missing, then reappear the next day with the handwriting slightly changed. At first, I thought it was exhaustion. But one night, around 3 a.m., I saw someone on the security feed, standing completely still in the corridor outside the freezer. It wasn't the janitor, and it definitely wasn't the embalmer. The man wore a long dark coat, his head tilted slightly, watching the camera. I zoomed in, but the screen glitched, lines cutting across his face. When the picture cleared, he was gone. The next morning, I asked my coworker about it. He gave me this strange look and said, "You must have seen the night watcher." Then he laughed, but not like it was a joke. More like he wished it was. The next few nights, I tried to shrug it off. But the unease kept building. Every shift felt longer, the silence thicker. I started noticing small changes. Papers moved, drawers left open, the freezer door slightly ajar. Then I found the note. It slipped under the office door, no name, no handwriting I recognized. Just 4 words, "Stop watching the cameras." I showed it to the embalmer, Sam, but he barely glanced at it. He said, "People do weird things when they work with death too long. Try not to think about it." Then he changed the subject. That night, when I checked the camera feed again, one of the angles was blacked out, camera 7, the freezer corridor. The system said it was manually disabled. When I went down to check, I swear I felt someone behind me. The hall was dim, and the air colder than usual. I kept telling myself not to turn around. But I did. And at the far end, near the freezer door, I saw that same dark coat, just the outline motionless. "Sam," I called out. Nothing. Then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping back into the shadows until it disappeared completely. The next morning, Sam didn't show up. The owner called to say he'd quit without notice, no explanation. But when I went to his locker, it was still full. Inside, tucked behind his uniform, was a small USB drive labeled Night Logs. I plugged it into the office computer. There were folders of footage, hours of camera recordings, but from angles I didn't even know existed. Private ones, hidden ones. Some even showed the prep room from above. And in almost every clip, sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., the same figure would appear, standing near the freezer, sometimes closer to the embalming table. Watching. But the worst part wasn't the figure. It was who he was watching. Me. I couldn't breathe. Every file showed me doing normal things, writing, cleaning, checking the logbooks, while that shadow lingered just out of the frame. Sometimes his reflection appeared behind me in the glass door, but when I turned, nothing was there. That night, I decided I wasn't coming back. I packed my things and waited for sunrise. But before I left, I checked the security room one last time. The monitors were all on. Every feed is clear. Except one. Camera 7, the freezer corridor. The screen was flickering again, static rolling across the image. I leaned closer. The figure was standing there, the same dark coat, only now he was holding something. A clipboard. My clipboard. My throat went dry. I looked down at my desk. The clipboard was gone. I turned toward the hallway just as the security lights flicked off. I ran. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, and behind me, I heard another set, slower, heavier, steady. When I reached the exit, the door wouldn't open. The lock had been jammed. I looked back and saw the reflection in the glass, someone standing inches behind me. But when I turned, there was no one. Only my clipboard, lying on the floor, a new note taped to it. It said, "You were never alone." The police said there was no sign of forced entry, no one else on the property. They checked the footage, but all the files from that week were gone. Every folder from Sam's USB had been wiped. They found his car abandoned a few miles away, keys still in the ignition. I tried to tell them about the figure, about the notes, but the officer just gave me that same look, the one people give when they think you're not right in the head. I left the funeral home for good. Still, for weeks after, I kept seeing things move in the corners of my apartment, hearing faint footsteps in the hall. I thought maybe it was trauma or sleep deprivation. But one night, when I came home, the air felt colder. My living room light was on. On the table sat my old clipboard. The same one, with one final note taped to it. It said, "Stop watching the cameras." I don't know if the night watcher was ever real. Maybe it was Sam. Maybe it was someone else who worked there long before me. Or maybe it was something we created ourselves. The kind of presence that comes when you spend too long surrounded by silence and regret. Sometimes I think about how easy it is to lose track of who's watching who. You stare into a monitor long enough, waiting for something to happen, and eventually, you start to feel like the thing on the other side is waiting for you. I've stopped taking night jobs. I can't handle dark corridors or quiet buildings anymore. But sometimes when I pass a window at night, I catch my reflection, and for a split second, I swear it moves a little slower than I do. Maybe that's what the note meant. Maybe we will all become watchers eventually. Because when you spend your nights surrounded by the dead, you start to realize they're not the ones staring back at you. You are.